I never believed in miracles. Not once in my 23 years as a cardiologist. I believed in science, in numbers, in the rhythm of monitors and the precision of medicine. Miracles were for other people. People who needed comfort when science had no answers left to give. Until the night everything I thought I knew about life and death was turned upside down by a patient who should have never opened his eyes again. My name is Dr. Michael Harrison, and I've spent over 2 decades working in the cardiac intensive care unit at Chicago Memorial Hospital. I've seen hearts stop and start again. I've watched families say goodbye to fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. I've delivered news that shattered lives and news that rebuilt them. Through it all, I remained anchored to one belief. Medicine could explain everything. If a heart stopped, we knew why. If someone recovered, there was always a medical reason. Always. The human heart beats roughly 100,000 times a day. It's a muscle that never rests, never takes a break, never asks for permission to keep you alive. In my career, I've restarted hearts that had given up, repaired arteries that had collapsed, and saved lives that hung by the thinnest thread. But I had never, not once, seen anything that couldn't be explained by medical science. Until Robert. It was 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday in October when the ambulance brought him in. Robert Mitchell, 56 years old, construction supervisor from the south side of Chicago, massive cardiac arrest at home. His wife had found him collapsed in their kitchen, face down on the cold tile floor. No pulse, no breathing. The paramedics had worked on him for 27 minutes before they got his heart beating again. 27 minutes. In cardiac medicine, we call it the golden hour, but really, every minute without oxygen to the brain is a step closer to permanent damage. After 27 minutes, the odds of meaningful recovery dropped to almost nothing. Robert's heart was beating when he arrived at our ICU, but his brain had been without oxygen for far too long. I examined him immediately. His pupils were fixed and dilated. His breathing was entirely dependent on the ventilator. The EEG showed minimal brain activity, just enough to keep his body functioning, but nowhere near enough for consciousness, memory, or the 1,000 little things that make us who we are. I've seen this condition hundreds of times. The medical term is hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy. In simpler terms, his brain had been starved of oxygen for too long. His wife, Margaret, arrived 30 minutes after the ambulance. She was still in her nightgown, her gray hair disheveled, her eyes red with tears she hadn't had time to shed. Behind her came their 2 children, Sarah, 28, and David, 25. When they saw Robert lying there, connected to machines that were breathing for him, keeping his heart beating in a steady rhythm, Margaret's knees buckled. Sarah caught her mother's arm while David stood frozen in the doorway, staring at his father as if he could will him back to consciousness. "Doctor," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the ventilator. "Please tell me he's going to be okay. Please tell me my husband is coming home." I've had this conversation more times than I can count. It never gets easier. I sat down with Margaret and her children in the small family conference room just outside the ICU. The walls were painted a soft blue, supposedly calming, though I'd never found anything calming about delivering devastating news to people whose worlds had just collapsed. "Mrs. Mitchell," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Your husband's heart is stable now. We've managed to restore normal rhythm, and his vital signs are strong. But I need you to understand what happened during those 27 minutes when his heart wasn't beating." Margaret leaned forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Sarah reached over and placed her hand on her mother's shoulder. "The human brain can only survive without oxygen for about 4 to 6 minutes before permanent damage begins to occur. Your husband was without oxygen for much longer than that. The scans we've taken show significant brain injury. While his heart is beating normally now, his brain activity is minimal." "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice cracking slightly. "It means that even if he survives, there's a very high probability that he will never wake up. And if he does wake up, he may not be the man you remember. Memory loss, cognitive impairment, inability to recognize faces or speak. These are all possibilities we have to prepare for." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at me for a long moment, then looked back toward the ICU where her husband lay motionless. "But there's still a chance," she said finally. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of faith that I'd heard from countless families before. Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be honest with you. In my experience with this level of brain injury, the chances of meaningful recovery are less than 1%. I think it's important that you and your family understand what we're facing here. Before I continue, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. Stories like this one reach farther than you imagine. That's when Margaret did something that surprised me. She didn't break down. She didn't scream or demand second opinions. Instead, she stood up, straightened her shoulders, and looked me directly in the eyes. Dr. Harrison, I appreciate your honesty. I really do. But you need to understand something about my family. We've been through hard times before. Robert and I immigrated here from Canada 32 years ago, with nothing but hope and faith. We've built a life together, raised our children, survived job losses and health scares. And through all of it, we've never stopped believing that God has a plan. She paused, her voice growing stronger. I know what the medical books say. I know what the statistics tell you. But my husband isn't a statistic. He's the man who held my hand through 2 difficult pregnancies. He's the father who taught our children how to ride bikes and how to be kind to others. He's the man who still leaves love notes in my lunch every morning after 34 years of marriage. And I'm not giving up on him now. Sarah nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. We understand the odds, Dr. Harrison. But we also understand faith. I admired their strength, but I'd seen faith clash with medical reality too many times. Still, there was something about Margaret's certainty that stayed with me as I made my evening rounds. The Mitchell family had set up camp in the ICU waiting room. Margaret had brought a small bag with changes of clothes, photo albums, and a worn Bible. Sarah and David took turns sitting with their father, talking to him as if he could hear every word. That first night, I checked on Robert at midnight. His condition remained unchanged. Stable heart rhythm, steady breathing with the ventilator's assistance, but no signs of consciousness. Through the glass partition, I could see Margaret sitting beside his bed, holding his hand and speaking quietly. I couldn't make out the words, but her lips moved in what looked like prayer. For the next 3 days, nothing changed medically. Robert's heart continued beating steadily. His blood pressure remained stable. But the EEG showed the same minimal brain activity. I ordered follow-up scans, hoping to see some improvement, but the results confirmed my initial assessment. The damage was extensive. The Mitchell family never left. They rotated sleeping shifts in the waiting room, taking turns sitting with Robert around the clock. They brought his favorite music, played it softly in his room. They talked to him about everyday things, the weather, family news, memories from when the children were small. And they prayed. Constantly. On the 4th day, Margaret asked to speak with me privately. Doctor, I know you think we're being unrealistic, she said. I can see it in your eyes when you look at us. You think we're in denial. I was taken aback by her directness. Mrs. Mitchell, I think you're a loving family dealing with an impossible situation. I've seen many families struggle with hope and acceptance. It's completely normal. We're not struggling with hope, Dr. Harrison. We're holding on to it. There's a difference. She looked back toward Robert's room. My husband may not be responding to your tests, but he's still fighting. I can feel it. Call it a wife's intuition. Call it whatever you want. But he's not ready to go yet. That evening, as I completed my rounds at 9:45 at night, I found myself standing longer than usual at Robert's bedside. His face was peaceful, almost serene, despite the ventilator tube and monitoring wires. Margaret was there again, as she had been every night, whispering softly near his ear. This time, I was close enough to hear fragments of what she was saying. Robert, honey, Sarah got that promotion at work today. She wanted to tell you herself. And David fixed the fence in the backyard. You know, the one you've been meaning to get to for months. She laughed softly through her tears. He used your tools. Said he could almost hear you telling him he was doing it wrong. She paused, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. We're all here, sweetheart. We're not going anywhere. You take your time. But when you're ready, we'll be right here waiting for you. Something about that moment made me pause. In all my years of medicine, I'd grown accustomed to the sterile environment of the ICU, the beeping monitors, the hushed conversations of medical staff, the clinical efficiency that keeps us moving from one patient to the next. But standing there, watching Margaret speak to her husband with such unwavering love and certainty, I realized I was witnessing something that didn't fit into any medical textbook I'd ever read. The next morning would bring day 5 of Robert's coma. According to every medical protocol, every study, every piece of evidence-based medicine I'd learned over more than 2 decades of practice, Robert Mitchell should have been declared brain dead. His family should have been preparing for funeral arrangements. The machines keeping him alive should have been disconnected, allowing his body to finally rest. But something told me to wait one more day. Day 5 began like every other day since Robert's arrival. I made my rounds at 7 o'clock in the morning, checking vitals, reviewing charts, adjusting medications. Robert's condition remained unchanged. Heart stable, breathing assisted, brain activity minimal. The EEG readings looked identical to the previous 4 days. Medically, nothing had shifted. But something felt different in the ICU that morning. Margaret was sitting in her usual spot beside Robert's bed. But instead of the quiet whispers I'd grown accustomed to, she was speaking in a normal voice, telling him about their grandson's upcoming baseball game. Sarah and David were there too, earlier than usual. David was reading from a sports magazine, updating his father on the Cubs' latest season, while Sarah showed him photos on her phone from a family barbecue they'd had the previous summer. "Good morning, Dr. Harrison," Margaret said when she noticed me reviewing Robert's chart. "How does everything look today?" "Medically, everything remains stable," I replied, using the same careful language I'd maintained for days. "His heart rhythm is strong, blood pressure is good, all vital signs are within normal ranges." "And his brain activity?" I paused, looking at the EEG printout. "No significant changes from yesterday, Mrs. Mitchell." She nodded, but I noticed something in her expression. Not disappointment, but a quiet confidence that I couldn't quite understand. "Doctor, can I ask you something?" Sarah spoke up from the other side of the bed. "In all your years of experience, have you ever seen someone wake up after this long?" It was a question I'd been dreading. "Sarah, I want to be completely honest with you. In cases like your father's, with this level of brain injury and this amount of time in a coma, I have not personally witnessed a full recovery. The medical literature suggests that after 5 days of deep coma following cardiac arrest with prolonged oxygen deprivation, the chances of meaningful recovery are extremely low." "But not impossible?" David asked, looking up from his magazine. I chose my words carefully. In medicine, we deal in probabilities, not absolutes. But I think it's important that your family begins to consider all possibilities, including the difficult ones. That afternoon, I was called into the office of Dr. Patricia Wells, our chief of cardiology. Patricia had been at Chicago Memorial for 30 years, and she'd mentored me through my early years as an attending physician. She was known for her sharp medical judgment and her ability to have difficult conversations with families who were struggling to accept medical realities. "Michael, I need to talk to you about the Mitchell case," she said, gesturing for me to sit down across from her desk. "What about it?" "It's been 5 days. The family is camping out in our ICU. The patient shows no signs of meaningful brain activity, and you're continuing aggressive care for what appears to be a futile case. I've reviewed the scans, the EEG results, everything. This man has suffered extensive hypoxic brain injury. What exactly are we waiting for?" I had been asking myself the same question. "The family is... they're not ready to have end-of-life discussions yet. Michael, part of our job is helping families understand medical reality, even when it's painful. Especially when it's painful. This family needs guidance, and they're looking to you to provide it. Continuing aggressive care in a hopeless situation isn't always the kindest approach." She was right, of course. I'd had similar conversations with dozens of families over the years. I'd helped them understand when it was time to let go, when further medical intervention was prolonging suffering rather than preserving meaningful life. But something about the Mitchell family made me hesitate. "Give me one more day," I said finally. "If there's no change by tomorrow morning, I'll have the end-of-life conversation with them." Patricia studied my face for a moment. "This isn't like you, Michael. You've always been direct with families about medical realities. What's different about this case? I wasn't sure how to answer that question, because I didn't fully understand it myself. The family has such strong faith. They're not in denial. They understand the medical situation perfectly. But they have this certainty that something's going to change. I've never seen anything quite like it. Faith doesn't alter brain scans, Michael. It doesn't reverse hypoxic injury. I know that. Intellectually, I know that. But there's something about their conviction that makes me want to wait just a little longer. That evening, I found myself making an unusual decision. Instead of going home at my usual time of 6:30 at night, I stayed at the hospital. I told myself I was catching up on paperwork, but really I wanted to observe the Mitchell family more closely. I wanted to understand what I was seeing that made me reluctant to recommend discontinuing Robert's care. At 8 o'clock at night, I walked past Robert's room and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. Margaret, Sarah, and David were standing around his bed, holding hands in a circle. Margaret was speaking, but it wasn't the quiet bedside conversation I'd grown accustomed to. It was a prayer, spoken aloud with a strength and conviction that filled the room. God, we know you have a plan for Robert, she was saying. We don't understand why this happened, but we trust that you're not finished with him yet. We're asking for a miracle, not because we deserve it, but because we believe in your power to do impossible things. Sarah's voice joined in. Dad, if you can hear us, we need you to fight. We need you to come back to us. Your granddaughter Emma drew you a picture yesterday. She wants to show it to you herself. David added. Remember when you taught me to drive, Dad? You said the most important thing wasn't avoiding accidents, but knowing how to get back on the road when something went wrong. We're waiting for you to get back on the road. I found myself leaning against the doorframe, listening to something I'd never witnessed in 23 years of medical practice. This wasn't the desperate pleading of a family in denial. This was something else entirely. A calm, confident petition that seemed to fill the room with an energy I couldn't name or measure. After they finished praying, Margaret noticed me standing in the doorway. Instead of appearing embarrassed or self-conscious, she smiled. Dr. Harrison, would you like to join us for a moment? I stepped into the room, feeling oddly like an intruder in a space that had become sacred in ways that had nothing to do with medicine. Mrs. Mitchell, I don't want to intrude on your family time. You're not intruding. You've been taking care of Robert for 5 days. In our minds, that makes you family too. I approached the bed and looked down at Robert. His face was peaceful, his breathing assisted but steady. The monitors showed the same readings they'd shown for days: stable heart rhythm, normal blood pressure, minimal brain activity. Doctor, Margaret said quietly, I know what the medical books tell you. I know what your training says about cases like Robert's. But I need you to know that we're not asking you to ignore science. We're asking you to leave room for something beyond science. What do you mean? I mean that medicine can tell us what's broken, but it can't always tell us what's possible. You've done everything you can for Robert's body. Now we're working on his spirit. At 10:15 at night, I finally left the hospital. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Margaret had said. In all my years of medical training, I'd been taught to rely on evidence, on measurable outcomes, on peer-reviewed studies. The idea of leaving room for something beyond science felt foreign, almost irresponsible. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of Chicago, I found myself wondering, what if the Mitchells were right? What if there were forces at work that couldn't be measured by EEGs or captured in brain scans? What if faith, real, unwavering faith, could reach places that medicine couldn't touch? I went to bed that night with a strange feeling in my chest. For the first time in my career, I was hoping to be wrong about a medical prognosis. I was hoping that 23 years of experience and training would be proved inadequate by something I didn't understand. The next morning would be day 6. According to every protocol I'd ever learned, it would be time to have the end-of-life conversation with the Mitchell family. But something deep in my gut told me to wait just a little longer. As I fell asleep, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since I was a child. I whispered a quiet prayer that I might be wrong about Robert Mitchell. Day 6 arrived with the gray light of dawn filtering through the hospital windows. I arrived at 7:30 in the morning, earlier than usual. I told myself it was to catch up on paperwork, But the truth was, I couldn't sleep. The conversation with Patricia Wells weighed heavily on my mind. Today was the day I would need to have the end-of-life discussion with the Mitchell family. I stopped by the cafeteria first, buying a cup of coffee I didn't really want, delaying the inevitable. When I finally made my way to the ICU, I expected to find the usual scene. Margaret at Robert's bedside, Sarah and David taking their morning shifts, the quiet rhythm of prayers and whispered conversations. But something was different. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, one of our most experienced ICU nurses, was standing at the nursing station with a puzzled expression on her face. She'd been monitoring Robert's room all night, and when she saw me approaching, she immediately walked over. "Dr. Harrison, I need to show you something," she said, her voice carrying an unusual urgency. "Robert's readings from last night." She handed me the overnight chart, pointing to a section of EEG readings taken at 2:15 in the morning. "Look at this," she said. For about 15 minutes, starting at 2 o'clock, his brain activity spiked. Not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable. Then it returned to baseline levels. I studied the printout carefully. Jennifer was right. There was a clear increase in brainwave activity during that 15-minute window, unlike anything we'd seen in the previous 5 days. "Was there any external stimulus?" I asked. "Any procedures, medication changes, anything that might explain this?" "Nothing. The only people in the room were his family. They were praying." I felt a chill run down my spine. In my medical training, I'd learned to look for correlation and causation, to identify measurable factors that could explain changes in a patient's condition. But this spike in brain activity had no medical explanation. "Have you seen anything like this before?" I asked Jennifer. She shook her head. "In 15 years of ICU nursing, I've never seen brain activity increase like this in a patient with this level of injury. Dr. Harrison, I know how this sounds, but what if they're right? What if something's happening that we can't measure?" I looked toward Robert's room, where Margaret was sitting in her usual spot, holding his hand and speaking softly. The morning sun was casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, the entire scene looked different to me. Less clinical, more human. "Let's order another EEG," I said. "I want to monitor his brain activity more closely today." At 10 o'clock in the morning, I had scheduled the family meeting. I'd planned to sit down with Margaret, Sarah, and David to discuss end-of-life care options. But as I walked toward the family conference room, I found myself questioning everything I'd prepared to say. The family was waiting for me, sitting around the small table with the same quiet strength they'd shown since day one. Margaret had dark circles under her eyes from days of sleeping in hospital chairs, but her posture remained straight, her gaze steady. "Dr. Harrison," she said as I sat down, "we know why you asked us here. You think it's time to let Robert go." Her directness caught me off guard. "Mrs. Mitchell, we need to discuss Robert's prognosis and your options moving forward. And we appreciate that. But before you say anything else, I need to tell you what happened last night." I leaned forward, remembering the unusual EEG spike Jennifer had shown me. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I was sitting with Robert, holding his hand, and praying like I do every night. Sarah and David were there too. We were asking God to give us a sign, some indication of what we should do, how long we should hope. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. "Doctor," Robert squeezed my hand. I felt my heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Mitchell, sometimes family members can misinterpret reflexive movements." "It wasn't reflexive," David interrupted. "I saw it too. Mom asked him to squeeze her hand if he could hear us, and he did. 3 times. Gentle but deliberate." Sarah nodded. I was holding his other hand, and I felt it too. "Dr. Harrison?" My father squeezed both our hands. It wasn't random muscle movement. It was intentional. I studied their faces, looking for signs of wishful thinking or misinterpretation. But what I saw was 3 people who knew the difference between hope and reality, between reflexive movement and conscious response. "Did this happen more than once?" "Several times throughout the night," Margaret said. "Every time we asked him to squeeze if he could hear us, he did. And Doctor, there's something else." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. "I've been keeping track of everything we say to him, all our prayers, all our conversations. Last night, when I asked him to squeeze once for yes and twice for no, he responded correctly to simple questions. Did he know where he was? 1 squeeze. Did he remember what happened? 2 squeezes. Could he hear us praying? 1 squeeze. My medical training told me to be skeptical. Unconscious patients sometimes exhibited reflexive responses that families interpreted as communication. But the timing of these responses with the EEG spike at 2:15 in the morning was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Mitchell, I'd like to run some additional tests today. More comprehensive brain monitoring, response assessments. If Robert is showing signs of consciousness, we need to document it properly. Of course, she said. But doctor, there's one more thing I need you to know. Last night, when we were praying, I asked God for a specific sign. I asked that if Robert was going to recover, let him open his eyes at exactly noon today. I looked at my watch. It was 10:45 in the morning. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand the importance of faith in difficult times, but I'm not asking you to believe in miracles, Dr. Harrison. I'm just asking you to be in his room at noon. Can you do that? Something in her voice, not desperation, but absolute certainty, made me nod. I'll be there. For the next hour and 15 minutes, I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I tried to review other patient files, but my mind kept returning to Robert's room. I told myself I was being unscientific, allowing emotion to cloud my medical judgment. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to happen. At 11:55, I made my way to Robert's room. The entire family was there. Margaret, Sarah, David, and now Robert's elderly mother, who had arrived that morning from their hometown outside Chicago. They were standing around his bed, not praying this time, just watching and waiting. Jennifer Walsh was checking his vitals, adjusting the ventilator settings. She looked at me questioningly when I entered the room. Just monitoring the patient, I said, though we both knew I was there for reasons that had nothing to do with standard medical protocol. 11:58. The room was completely silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors and the rhythmic sound of the ventilator. Margaret stood at Robert's right side, holding his hand. Sarah and David flanked the bed, while Robert's mother sat in the corner chair, her lips moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. 11:59. I found myself holding my breath, feeling foolish for putting any credence in the timing of a prayer, but unable to look away from Robert's face. And then, at exactly noon, something impossible happened. Robert's eyelids fluttered. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflexive movement that I was interpreting through the lens of expectation. But then his eyes opened, slowly, deliberately, as if he was emerging from the deepest sleep of his life. His gaze was unfocused at first, blinking against the fluorescent lights of the ICU. But then his eyes found Margaret's face, and something in his expression changed. Recognition. Awareness. Life. "Robert?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. His lips moved, though no sound came out at first due to the ventilator tube. I immediately moved to his side, checking his pupils, his responsiveness, trying to process what I was witnessing through the framework of medical science. His pupils were reactive. His eyes tracked movement. When I held up my hand and asked him to follow it with his gaze, he did so perfectly. "Mrs. Mitchell," I said, my voice barely steady. "I need to remove the ventilator tube to see if he can speak." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I carefully removed the breathing tube, monitoring his oxygen levels closely. Robert coughed slightly, then took his first independent breath in 6 days. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice hoarse but unmistakably conscious. I'm here." The room erupted in quiet sobs of relief and joy. Sarah grabbed David's hand while Robert's mother covered her mouth in amazement. But I stood frozen, staring at a man who, according to every medical text I'd ever studied, should not have been capable of conscious thought, let alone speech and recognition. "Robert," I said, my voice professional despite the chaos in my mind. "Do you know where you are?" He looked at me, his eyes now completely focused and alert. "Hospital," he said simply. "Chicago Memorial. You're Dr. Harrison. You've been taking care of me." The monitors around us continued their steady beeping, showing vital signs that were not just stable, but normal. His heart rate was appropriate for someone who had just awakened. His blood pressure was within healthy ranges. His oxygen saturation was perfect. But none of that explained how a man with severe hypoxic brain injury had just awakened with full consciousness, perfect recognition, and clear speech. "Robert," Margaret said, leaning close to his face, "do you remember what happened?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as if he was accessing memories from a place far away. "I remember falling in the kitchen," he said slowly. "I remember pain in my chest. And then—" He paused, looking around the room at his family's tear-streaked faces. "And then, I remember hearing all of you. Every word. Every prayer. Every story you told me about Emma's drawing and David fixing the fence and Sarah's promotion. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. 'Robert?' I said, my voice barely a whisper. 'You heard us? While you were unconscious?' He nodded slowly, his eyes moving from face to face around the room. Every word. Every prayer. Every story. The medical part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible. Patients in deep comas, especially those with severe hypoxic brain injury, don't retain auditory memories. They don't process complex conversations. They certainly don't remember specific details from days of bedside vigils. But Robert was looking directly at his wife with complete lucidity. "Margaret, you told me about Emma's drawing yesterday. The one with the purple flowers and the house with too many windows. You said she drew it because purple is my favorite color." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "You heard that?" "I heard everything. David, you read me that article about the Cubs trading their best pitcher. You were angry about it, said the management didn't understand loyalty." David's eyes widened. He looked at me, then back at his father. "Dad, that was 3 days ago. You were completely unconscious." "Sarah," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger. "You played me that song on your phone, the one from your wedding that always makes you cry. You told me Mark sends his love and that he's taking care of everything at home." Sarah broke down completely, sobbing into her hands. "This is impossible. The doctors said you couldn't hear us. They said your brain wasn't processing anything." I was struggling to maintain my composure. In 23 years of practicing medicine, I had never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of consciousness, brain function, and the boundaries between life and death quite like this. "Robert," I said, pulling up a chair beside his bed, "I need to ask you some questions. Do you remember the night you collapsed?" I remember the pain in my chest. Sharp, like someone was squeezing my heart with a fist. I remember falling and thinking about Margaret finding me. I remember being scared that I was going to die without saying goodbye. And then? Then everything went dark. But it wasn't like sleeping. It was like being in a deep, quiet place where I could hear voices from far away. At first, the voices were medical, doctors and nurses talking about my condition, about tests and medications. But then I started hearing my family. He turned to look at Margaret, his eyes filling with tears. "Honey, I heard every prayer. When you asked God to bring me back, when you told him you weren't ready to say goodbye, when you promised you'd take better care of yourself if he let me come home. I heard Sarah reading me the letters Emma wrote, even though she can't spell most words yet. I heard David talking about the business, about how he wants to make me proud." "But Robert," I interrupted, my scientific mind struggling to process what I was hearing. "The EEG showed minimal brain activity. According to every test we ran, your brain wasn't processing auditory information." Robert looked at me with a small smile. "Doctor, I know you're a man of science. I respect that. But there are things that happen in that quiet place between life and death that your machines can't measure. I mean that while my body was here, hooked up to your monitors, part of me was somewhere else. Somewhere I could see my family's love, hear their voices, feel their faith holding me like a rope pulling me back to life." Jennifer Walsh had been standing quietly in the corner, but now she stepped forward. "Dr. Harrison, there's something else you should know. Last night, during that 15-minute spike in brain activity, that's exactly when the family was having their longest prayer session. I was monitoring from the nurse's station. They prayed from 2 o'clock until 2:15 in the morning. The pieces were falling into place in a way that defied every medical explanation I could think of. Robert's brain activity had spiked during the exact time his family was praying most intensively. He had awakened at the precise moment his wife had asked God for a sign, and now he was recounting conversations and prayers that, medically, he should never have been able to hear or remember. "Robert," Margaret said, her voice shaking with emotion, "do you remember what I asked God for last night? The specific thing I prayed for?" Robert's eyes brightened. "You asked for a sign. You said if I was going to recover, if God wanted me to come back, to let me open my eyes at noon today." Margaret looked at me, her face radiant with a mixture of vindication and overwhelming gratitude. "Dr. Harrison, I asked for that sign at 2 o'clock this morning. I never told anyone else about it. Not Sarah, not David, not the nurses. How could Robert know that unless he heard me? I had no answer. I had no medical explanation for what I was witnessing. According to everything I'd learned in medical school, during my residency, in my decades of practice, Robert Mitchell should have been brain dead. Even if he had somehow awakened, he should have had severe cognitive impairment, memory loss, inability to speak clearly, or recognize faces. Instead, he was lying in his hospital bed, fully conscious, articulate, and recounting specific details from days of family conversations that occurred while he was in a coma. "Doctor," Robert said, noticing my stunned expression, "I can see you're struggling with this. I understand. If someone had told me this story 6 days ago, I would have thought they were crazy. How do you feel? Physically, I mean. Tired. Like I've been asleep for a very long time. But otherwise, normal. My thinking is clear. I remember everything from before the heart attack. I remember my life, my family, my work. It's like I never left, except for those 6 days when I was listening from somewhere else." I excused myself and walked quickly to the nurse's station, where I immediately called Dr. Wells. "Patricia, I need you to come to the ICU right now. Robert Mitchell is awake." "What do you mean awake?" "I mean conscious, talking, recognizing family members, remembering conversations from his coma. I need a neurologist here immediately." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Michael, are you telling me that a patient with severe hypoxic brain injury just woke up after 6 days with full consciousness?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. I'll be right there." While waiting for Dr. Wells and the neurologist, I returned to Robert's room. The family was surrounding his bed, but they weren't celebrating in the way I might have expected. Instead, they were calm, grateful, but not surprised. "You knew this was going to happen," I said to Margaret. It wasn't a question. "I believed it was going to happen," she corrected. "There's a difference between knowing and believing. But yes, I never doubted that God was going to bring Robert back to us." "How could you be so certain?" Margaret looked at her husband, then back at me. "Dr. Harrison, have you ever loved someone so much that you'd fight heaven and earth to keep them with you?" I thought about my own marriage, my own family. "Yes, I suppose I have." "Then you understand. Love doesn't accept impossible. Love doesn't recognize medical statistics. Love just fights until there's nothing left to fight for." Robert reached for his wife's hand. "She never stopped fighting for me, doctor. Even when I was in that quiet place, I could feel her love pulling me back." At 12:30 in the afternoon, Dr. Wells arrived with Dr. Amanda Foster, our chief neurologist. I watched their faces as they examined Robert, tested his reflexes, checked his cognitive function. Both women had the same expression I'd had an hour earlier, professional skepticism slowly giving way to complete bewilderment. Robert answered every question correctly. He knew his name, his address, the date, the president, simple math problems. His motor functions were perfect. His speech was clear and appropriate. Dr. Foster administered a mini mental state examination, and Robert scored perfectly. "This is medically unprecedented," Dr. Foster whispered to me outside the room. "I've reviewed his scans, his EEG readings, everything. This man should not be conscious, let alone cognitively intact." "I know," Michael, in 30 years of neurology, I have never seen anything like this. We need to run every test we can think of. Brain scans, blood work, comprehensive neurological assessments, because what I just witnessed doesn't fit into any medical framework I understand. As the afternoon progressed, Robert grew stronger. The ventilator was removed completely. He sat up in bed. He asked for water, for food, for news about what he'd missed during his 6 days away from the world. Every medical test confirmed what seemed impossible. His brain was functioning normally. But the most powerful moment came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when Robert asked to speak with me privately. His family stepped out of the room, giving us space to talk. Robert adjusted himself in the hospital bed, looking more alert and energetic than any patient should after 6 days in a coma following massive cardiac arrest. "Dr. Harrison," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I need to tell you something that happened while I was away." I pulled my chair closer to his bed. "I'm listening. While I was in that place between life and death, I wasn't just hearing my family's voices. I was hearing yours too. I felt my heart skip a beat. Mine? Every conversation you had with my family. Every time you prepared them for the worst. Every moment you struggled with whether to recommend ending." He paused, studying my face. "Doctor, I heard you praying for me that last night." The room felt like it was spinning. I remembered that moment. The quiet prayer I'd whispered before falling asleep, asking to be wrong about Robert's prognosis. It had been private, personal, something I'd never told anyone. "You heard that?" "I did. And I need you to know that your prayer, combined with my family's faith, created something powerful enough to pull me back from wherever I was." I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was telling me. In medical school, we learn about the physiological processes of consciousness, about brain waves and neural activity, about the measurable aspects of awareness. But no textbook had prepared me for this conversation. "Robert, I don't understand how any of this is possible." "Doctor, can I ask you something? In all your years of medicine, have you ever seen something that science couldn't fully explain?" I thought for a moment. There have been cases where recovery exceeded expectations, where outcomes defied statistical probabilities, but nothing like this. What if I told you that where I was during these 6 days, I could see things differently? That I could see the connections between prayer and healing, between love and life, between faith and medical miracles? I would say that sounds like a near-death experience, which can be explained by brain chemistry during trauma. Robert smiled. "You're a good doctor, Dr. Harrison. You're trying to fit what happened to me into a framework that makes sense to your training. But some things are bigger than frameworks." He reached for the cup of water on his bedside table, taking a slow sip. "Let me tell you what I saw. I saw you standing outside my room at 9:45 at night, 3 days ago, questioning everything you believed about medicine. I saw you reading my chart over and over, looking for something you'd missed. I saw you care about my family in ways that went beyond professional duty." I remembered that night exactly. I had stood outside his room, wrestling with doubts about my recommendation to end care. But I'd been alone. No one could have seen me. "Robert, how could you possibly know that?" "Because from where I was, I could see the battle happening for my life. My family's prayers on one side, medical science on the other, and you caught in the middle, torn between what you'd learned and what you were witnessing." And what was I witnessing? Love that refused to accept defeat, faith that created possibilities where none existed, and a doctor who was brave enough to wait one more day when everything in his training told him to give up. Tears were forming in my eyes, something that rarely happened in my professional life. "Robert, I need you to understand. Everything I told your family about your prognosis was accurate based on medical evidence. The brain scans, the EEG readings, the statistical outcomes for cases like yours. They all pointed to the same conclusion. I know that, and you were right to tell them. But doctor, what if medical evidence only shows us part of the picture? What if there are forces at work in healing that your instruments can't measure?" At 5:30 in the afternoon, Robert's family returned to the room. The change in atmosphere was electric. Where there had been quiet vigil and whispered prayers, now there was laughter, conversation, and the sound of a family reunited with someone they thought they'd lost forever. Margaret sat beside Robert's bed, holding his hand as she had for 6 days, but now he was squeezing back, responding, present in ways that filled the room with joy. "Mom," Sarah said, "should we call Emma? She's been asking about Grandpa every day." "Let's wait until tomorrow," Margaret replied. "I want to make sure your father is strong enough for a very excited 8-year-old. Robert chuckled, the first time I'd heard him laugh. "I can't wait to see that drawing." "Purple flowers, right?" "Purple flowers and a house with too many windows," Margaret confirmed, laughing through fresh tears. I spent another hour in Robert's room, conducting follow-up neurological tests, checking his cardiac function, monitoring his transition from ventilator support to independent breathing. Every test came back normal, better than normal actually. His heart rhythm was strong and steady. His cognitive function was completely intact. His memory, both short-term and long-term, was perfect. That evening, I drove home through the streets of Chicago with my mind reeling. I kept thinking about Robert's words. What if medical evidence only shows us part of the picture? For 23 years, I had built my career on the certainty that medicine could explain everything, that science had answers for every question, protocols for every situation, evidence for every outcome. I had been confident in my ability to predict, to diagnose, to treat based on measurable data. But Robert Mitchell had survived something that medical science said was impossible. He had retained consciousness and memory during a coma that should have erased both. He had awakened exactly when his wife's prayer had asked him to. And he had returned to his family not as a damaged survivor, but as the same man they had almost lost. That night, I called my own wife, Linda, and told her about Robert's case. She listened quietly as I described the medical impossibility of his recovery, the family's unwavering faith, the prayers he had somehow heard and remembered. "Michael," she said when I finished, "in 30 years of marriage, I've never heard you sound so shaken by a case. Because I've never experienced anything like this. Everything I thought I knew about consciousness, about brain function, about the boundaries between life and death, it's all been challenged by one patient who shouldn't be alive." "Maybe that's the point," Linda said gently. "Maybe you weren't supposed to have all the answers. Maybe this case was meant to show you that there's still mystery in the world, still room for things that can't be measured or explained." 3 days later, Robert Mitchell was discharged from Chicago Memorial Hospital. His heart function was completely normal. His neurological tests showed no signs of brain injury. He walked out of the hospital holding Margaret's hand, just as he had walked into their marriage 34 years earlier. Before he left, he stopped by my office. "Dr. Harrison, I wanted to thank you for something." "For what?" "I feel like I failed you medically. Every diagnosis I made was wrong. You didn't fail me. You kept me alive long enough for something greater than medicine to finish the job. And more importantly, you were humble enough to admit when you were witnessing something beyond your understanding." As I watched Robert and Margaret walk down the hospital corridor together, I realized that my career as a cardiologist had been fundamentally changed by this case. I still believed in medicine, in science, in the power of medical intervention to save lives. But I also now believed in something else, something that couldn't be measured by monitors or captured in brain scans. Some things belong not only to science, but to life and faith. Today, I still treat hearts that are broken, arteries that are blocked, and patients who hover between life and death. But I also listen more carefully to the families who refuse to give up hope. I pay attention to the prayers whispered in ICU rooms, and I've learned to leave space in my medical practice for possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of what I was taught to expect. If this story touched you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. You're not alone. And sometimes, in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, miracles are happening all around us.